the intentions of the author are immaterial. The intentions behind the text are immaterial. What matters is the text and your engagement with the text. You create meaning. Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today an incredible story, an extraordinary hoax, a literary hoax. A hoax that took place about 80 years ago in Australia, and a hoax that really gives us clues as to this age-old question: what does a poem mean? Does a poem have one meaning, possible meanings? Does it ever mean anything? And really, who knows? Does the author know best? Does the author count at all? And all those really profound questions about literature, really we can get a handle on them through this incredible story that took place about 80 years ago. So first we need to give a very brief overview of what happened in this incredible story. We're in Australia, 1941. And Australia at that time, being rather isolated geographically, of course. Remember, in 1941, it's a while ago. Communications and transport, of course, were nothing compared to what they are now. And so at the time, Australia was both isolated geographically and somewhat isolated culturally as well. It was a rather old-fashioned society where censorship still took place and hundreds of books were banned. And there was a debate within the literary world of Australia at that time, and really the debate, to simplify, because I am in no way a specialist of the question, to simplify really, is that you had two camps, broadly speaking. One which looked towards Europe, and especially modernism and the imagists and the symbolists and the Dadaists and the surrealists, all this incredible blooming of poetry, modernist poetry, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, all those people. And they really sold a Australian flavor, but within that world of, broadly speaking, modernism. The other camp was, let's say, against modernism, to simplify again, and what they wanted really was a return to what they said was meaningful poetry, a poetry that would not simply play with language or create beautiful images, but a poetry that would actually have meaning, that would be profoundly meaningful, and that's what they wanted. Now, the first camp, the modernist camp, was represented to some extent by somebody called Max Harris. And Max Harris was the editor, a 22-year-old editor of a literary magazine, which of course promoted a modernist type of poetry. And one day Max Harris receives a little package, 18 poems and a letter. And the letter had been written by somebody called Esther Malley. And Esther Malley, what was she saying really to Max Harris? She was saying, well, look, my brother just died. He was in his mid-20s, and his name was Ern Malley. Ern is short for Ernest. Ern Malley, she said, my brother just died of a terrible disease. And he had been an odd job type of guy, not really educated, worked as a car mechanic a little bit, worked here, worked there, never really held a steady job for a long time. But he also wrote poetry, and she said, well, I know nothing about poetry, I'm not very well educated myself. What do you think about those poems? Are they any good? You're the specialist, you are Max Harris, you're known for being a specialist of literature. Tell me what you think. Now, Max Harris was floored. That is, he was simply stunned by the quality of those poems. Admittedly, as he also said later, those poems he found a little bit difficult, sometimes obscure, but not all of them. But he said, taken together, those 18 poems are simply a revolution in Australian poetry. Those poems are important. That poet is important. Now, of course, he had never heard of Ern Malley, because by definition, Ern Malley had never been part of the literary circles of Australia. So he goes in search of him. He hires some sort of almost detective to find him. trying to piece clues from the letters that they exchanged, or he exchanged, with Esther Malley, the sister of the deceased poet. But he can't find him. He can't find really any sort of real information about him at all. And it turns out that the sort of address that was given is not really an address, and so there aren't really no clues. But the poems remain magnificent, and Max Harris is determined to publish those poems. Now, you understand, of course, that it was a hoax. That is a practical joke played on Max Harris. Those poems were written by two men, Stewart and Mac Stewart, and Macaulay and Stewart, and those two young men, government employees, civil servants. Remember, of course, the world was at war at the time. Those two men simply were in the second camp we talked about in the beginning. They were looking towards a different type of poetry, and they really hated modernist poetry, and they thought it was gibberish. It didn't mean anything. They thought that all those poets, like the Wasteland, for example, by T.S. Eliot, you may have beautiful lines, they sound good, but they say there's nothing in there. There's no message. It's just an exercise. And to prove their point, they created those poems, and therefore they created a poet, Ern Malley, who obviously now you understand never existed. They invented a name, they invented the sister of Ern Malley, they wrote the letter, and they wrote the 18 poems. And they were hoping that Max Harris would indeed like them and would publish them. And then they were hoping that once the poems had been published, they would reveal to the world that it had been a hoax and that Max Harris had been taken in, and that proved that that type of poetry was simply meaningless and ridiculous and anybody could do it. So it's an important point here, of course, behind all this. There is nothing personal, as they kept saying afterwards. There was nothing personal in that hoax. What they wanted to show was that real literature, real poetry, is not that type of poetry, and that this explosion of new type of poetry, let's say from the 1910s onwards, means nothing. It's just a joke. That's what they thought, and that's what they wanted to prove to the world. Now, Max Harris got wind of the fact that it was a hoax, and everybody started saying that it was a hoax. And indeed, the hoax was revealed. And Stewart and Macaulay, the two guys who wrote those poems, revealed how they had done them, how they had written those poems, and they said that they wrote those poems in one afternoon, with a little bit of beer on the side, the complete Shakespeare, a dictionary of synonyms, and some various reports, old bits of poetry that they had written, different sources. And they also explained that while writing the poems, their first aim, their only aim, was not to make sense, not to create meaning. They wanted poems that would simply mean nothing, that would have no message, no continuity of ideas, as they said, and simply no theme, no topics running through them. They just wanted gibberish. They wanted to write poetry that wouldn't mean anything. Well, of course, those poems were published, and eventually Max Harris was confronted with that situation. Those poems were fake. The poet he admired so much didn't exist, and it was all a joke played on him. And it could have stopped here. It could have ruined his career, maybe, or revealed a profound point about literature. But it goes way further, and that's where it becomes really, really fascinating. Max Harris, the editor of those poems, the publisher of those poems, was prosecuted by the Australian state for obscenity and immorality. Basically, the prosecution for the Australian government argued that those poems of Ern Malley and additional texts by Max Harris, but mostly the poems themselves, were full of references to, allusions to sex, bodily parts, the sexual act, all things that were deemed were simply unacceptable and immoral and obscene. Well, obscene is a very strong word as well. And now you understand why this hoax is so fascinating. We are in a situation which is simply mind-boggling. We have a man who published poems accused of obscenity, that is, accused of having published poetry that can be read as referring to sex. But those poems, and everybody knew that at that time by then, those poems were written with the express purpose of not meaning anything. Therefore, there certainly was no intention to have sexual references in those poems because they were written to mean nothing. The prosecution was arguing that Max Harris had published those poems and they were questioning the intention of the poet, obviously, because if they're saying those poems are immoral underneath, that is, when they are understood, they're not overtly obscene, there are no bad words in those, there are no direct references to sex or anything. So the prosecution was saying was actually, it's all about the poet and the poet's intentions in writing those lines. The prosecution was arguing that the poet's intentions were to make references to sex. But we know there was no such poet, it didn't exist. It was two men who had, again, the purpose of not making any references to anything, not making meaning, and therefore certainly not making any hidden covert references to sex or obscenities or any type of immorality. And yet, the prosecution went ahead. So we are in this situation where basically at some stage the prosecutor asked Max Harris, well, do you think it was all a joke then? And Max Harris says, I don't care what it was about. I do not care about the intentions of the author, only the text remains. And he's already taking the prosecution by surprise, because the prosecution wants to insist on who is behind it and what were the intentions of who was behind it. And when pushed further by the prosecution, Max Harris says, literally, I do not care about the circumstances of the creation of those poems. I only care about the poems. And Max Harris kept insisting until his dying days that those 18 poems, those Ern Malley poems, were good. Now, some of them contained bits from reports on the environment of Australia, simply put in poetic forms. That is, a long line, a report describing features of the Australian landscape, when put in poetic form, becomes poetry. And we understand this, of course, and we understand we can be fooled by it. But what Max Harris kept insisting is that despite the hoax, despite the intentions of not making meaning, despite the intentions of fooling him, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the existence of those texts and the quality of those texts as texts. So he was asked by the prosecution, well, can you interpret those poems? What do those poems mean for you? And Max Harris does so. He interprets those poems, and of course he does so like a pure literary specialist, by seeing meaning in the lines, by saying, well, this refers to that, and this is loneliness, and this is hankering after something, etc., etc., etc. But the prosecution says, no, we're reading the same lines, but we're seeing sex in it. We're seeing obscenity and immorality in those lines. And what you see is a reference to the solitude of the creator and the artistry of the world or whatever. And so they were really fighting for both meaning. What is the meaning of those poems? What do they mean? Do they mean anything in themselves? Can we agree on what they mean? And they were fighting on the role of the author. Now, of course, you all know Roland Barthes, the famous text, The Death of the Author, arguing along many decades ago, of course, arguing that it didn't matter who the creator of the text was. What mattered was the text. That the intentions of the author are irrelevant to the reading of the text. And this hoax, therefore, is an incredible example of that discussion, and not only an incredible example of that discussion, but a revelation, really, in terms of meaning and interpretation of literary texts. What is the meaning of a text? Well, as Borges, for example, or Alberto Mangel, one of his readers, says repeatedly, reading is a creative act. Reading creates meaning. The meaning is not in the pen of the author or in the keyboard of the author. The meaning is in the reading of the text and the generating of meaning through the act of reading. Borges said that, of course, much better than I can, but a text is nothing until somebody opens it and gives it life, and life really is meaning. And what Max Harris, the editor here, shows very clearly is that it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter at all who wrote the text and what kind of intention they had and what they wanted to do with that text. It really doesn't matter. If the text is good, the text is good. It doesn't matter the status of the text. It doesn't matter who's behind it and the intentions surrounding the publication of that text. The text is the text is the text. There is nothing else but the text, and you give it meaning. The intentions of the author in terms of perhaps message, meaning, etc. are entirely irrelevant to the act of reading. It may be nice to know that your favorite author wanted to write about, I don't know, love, but if by reading their book you never thought about love, but you thought about the morality of traveling while the world is going to well, who's right? Who's to say that you are not right, even though the intentions of your favorite author were never to get you to think about the environment, they wanted you to think about love, but maybe you thought, well, no, actually, this really, really makes me think about the environment and our role in it, and love, yeah, love is there, but I mean, and who's right? Why would the author be right? And Max Harris proves that the discussion, of course, resolves in the same answer as we found since, has been extensively demonstrated since, of course. The intentions of the author are immaterial. The intentions behind the text are immaterial. What matters is the text and your engagement with the text. You create meaning. Meaning doesn't exist without you. That is simply not true. Meaning may have been described by specialists, but it's entirely ridiculous, of course, to attach but one meaning to a text. And again, that the Australian prosecution saw meaning A in the poems, and Max Harris and his friends and many of his admirers saw meaning B or C in those poems, proves the point. Those poems in themselves were created with the intention of having no meaning. Then somebody saw meaning A and another one saw meaning B. Who's right of the three? Well, who's right, of course, is the reader, eventually. A reader with good intentions, that is, to really engage with the text, not in a preconceived subjective way, but in an objective way, letting themselves do the creation of the meaning. And that is what this wonderful hoax reminds us of. All this information comes from a book by Michael Hayward, the Ern Malley Affair, published in the 80s, I think, which really engages with many more aspects of the question. It's much more detailed about the background of all the actors and especially Australian cultural life at the time. But the reflections about the meaning of literature, of course, apply to us all, and I think that it's a great reminder to simply go buy books, borrow books, find books. There are plenty of them on our streets these days, certainly in Europe, and read and create meaning as you do, and just accept that whatever the author wanted you to do, no, the book is yours now, it's in your hands, it's in your mind, and you own the book, therefore you own the meaning that you create on the basis of that book. On these beautiful words, good reading, and until next time, bye-bye.